Winning southern states like Georgia has swayed the congressional majority in recent elections. Joining me now to discuss the progress made in Black political leadership and the continued fight for social justice are the co-founders of the Black Voters Matter Fund, Ms. LaTosha Brown and Mr. Cliff Albright. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. We just came out of the 2022 midterms, and it was a bit contentious in some areas. We were hearing a lot of concern about things like voter suppression, voter intimidation. Can you just talk a little bit about where you feel voting rights currently stand in our country?
So yeah, thanks for having us. Of course, a lot has been written and said and reported on in regards to the wave of voter suppression bills that started to sweep the country. Going back years actually to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act a few years ago, but really becoming more pronounced in 2021 after the election of 2020, after the spread of the big lie. We saw voter suppression bills in 49 states introduced, passed in around 20. We then saw another wave coming in 22, and there's a whole nother wave coming right now as we speak in 2023. The insurrection, the slow motion insurrection did not end on January 6th. And so we're still seeing waves of bills to make it harder to vote in every phase, making it harder to vote during early voting, making it harder to vote by mail, making it harder to vote on election day. And so we're continuing to see new ways that they're trying to come up with, including new ways to just outright intimidation. Of course, we're familiar with what's been going on in Florida, where Governor DeSantis literally arrested 20 people for registering to vote, when in fact it was the state that encouraged them, told them that they could get registered, approve their registration, approve their votes, and then they wind up getting arrested. That's almost the definition of entrapment. And so, but it's not just Florida. We're seeing it sweeping all across the country. And what we always try to remind people of is that we're seeing this wave. We're seeing this backlash, not because Black voters are not turning out, not because we don't have political power, not because our groups aren't doing a good job of organizing folks. We're seeing this backlash because the exact opposite is true. Is in response to our strength. It's in response to voters, Black and brown and other marginalized voters that impacted the 2020 election. Came back in Georgia and did it again last year in the Senate election, in states all across the country. And so that's when people cheat, right? We always say nobody cheats when they're winning. People cheat when they're losing, and that's what's going on with voter suppression in the country.
You touched on what we saw happen in Georgia. We saw Georgia come through, elect Senator Raphael Warnock to give Democrats that majority in the Senate. How important were Black voters in not only turning Georgia blue in 2020 for Joe Biden, but then going into the midterms for Raphael Warnock?
I think that we were incredibly important, but I want to say that it's not just about the election around whether it's blue or red around the parties. I think that we also have to recognize if we want a strong democracy, then you have to have participatory citizenry. And so part of what we're seeing, I think Black voters were absolutely key and critical in the Georgia election, but I also think that they're key and critical on the survival of democracy in this nation currently, right? And I think when you see Black organizers, but I think that we understand, I'm coming from a people who have a long history of oppression, have a long history of being excluded. We understand policies. We have a particular kind of understanding of policies that exclude us and what the ramifications of that are. And so I think part of what you see is I think Black voters really understand the larger picture, that not just on the local elections, and we're talking about the federal elections, but that Black voters are critical and key in terms of protecting democracy in this nation and being able to support progressive policies that would not only benefit our communities, but all communities, particularly working class and poor people that are often left out of the process.
Can I add on to that just for a second?
Absolutely.
Because LaTosha brought up such a critical point, right? We often see that when Black voting rights or Black rights in general are attacked, it's the entire country that suffers, right? We suffer disproportionately, and be clear, it's based in anti-Blackness. But let's take, for example, the insurrection on January 6th, right? People say that they try to overturn democracy, they try to overturn an election, but we need to be clear. They weren't really trying to overturn an entire national election. What were they really upset about? They were trying to overturn votes in Pennsylvania. Well, where in Pennsylvania? In Philadelphia, right? Black voters. They were upset about states like Georgia, right? Find me 11,700 votes, right? But it wasn't all of Georgia. They were upset about Atlanta, Fulton County, right? Black voters. They tried to throw out the votes in Michigan, but not all the votes in Michigan. They only wanted to throw out Wayne County, and more specifically, Detroit and Wayne County, right? Black voters. And so what starts as anti-blackness, what is directly laser focused on us, it's only a matter of time before it infects the entire system, the entire democracy. That's why it's really an issue that everybody has to take more seriously.
We've mentioned a few times today that we saw record numbers of Black candidates running in the 2022 midterms. How does seeing that representation affect Black voters? Does it push them to the polls more? Does it, encourage them to throw their support behind candidates and be more politically involved when they see somebody who looks like them?
I think it goes beyond just around it looks like them, because Herschel Walker technically looked like us, but Black voters were very clear about he did not represent our interests. I think Black voters are far more sophisticated than people give us credit for, that fundamentally we were able to actually connect with a candidate or candidates. We have an expectation that there were candidates that will be in office that will protect our interests, and that we have an expectation that those that do not protect our interests, whether they look like us or not, that is no value of us. We've been very critical as a community of those candidates that have put their head in the ring and have not necessarily supported our interests. And so I think what you see is, I think it's always, when you look at the caliber of Black candidates, I think one of the things for us to talk about is not just that more Black candidates are running. What you're seeing is more progressive Black candidates run. When you're looking at people like Ayanna Pressley, when you're looking at folks who are literally coming forth and saying, yes, we've got to actually make some major fundamental changes in the system, that we literally have to have criminal justice reform. We need voting rights like Senator Raphael Warnock. And so what you're seeing is, I think there are three things. One, I think the representation absolutely matters, because what we recognize is that when people come from a certain experience, it actually shapes their perspective of life. It shapes their perspective of the political landscape. And so that's very important to us. The second thing is, I think you're starting to see progressive younger candidates like in Florida and other places that are running for office and seeking and winning these offices, because we need a new message. We're looking for candidates that are not just saying, I'm going to stop the boogeyman of what's happening now, but that literally we have to stop some policies, but also we have to be forward thinking. I think that's the other thing. And I think the third thing is, I think that we are demanding candidates that have some relationship in community. That what we're seeing is that there is a need for people to actually see folks be more accountable. And I think you're going to see younger candidates. I think you're going to see candidates that are that oftentimes you would not have considered, some may not have considered electable. You're seeing candidates as young as 23 years old, run for office, for Congress, and win. And so I think it's really important that what we're seeing is, I think it's not just Black candidates. I think we're bringing an entirely new political paradigm and representation to the table for all Americans.
You mentioned young candidates running, and it made me think of Representative Maxwell Frost, who's the youngest representative elected. He's also Afro-Cuban. What are you hearing from young Black voters, especially coming out of 2022, especially gearing up already for 2024? How are they feeling about their political power at this point in time?
Yeah, I think, we saw in 22, we saw a large turnout. We saw it here in Georgia, particularly with the Senate race. We saw it in 20. But in 22, we saw it across the country. And I think it teaches a lesson, right? Who would have thought that when you actually respond to the issues that young folks care about, that you'll actually increase young voter turnout, right? And so what did we see? We saw one of the largest investments in green economies and in climate change, right? Young folks care about that issue, right? Black young folks in particular, what do we care about? We care about police violence. And also, although we haven't seen the passage of the George Floyd Act or the Breathe Act or something at the federal level, we did see some federal action on criminal justice reform, not the least of which was we saw a Department of Justice that made sure that those who killed Breonna Taylor would face justice. That does not happen if you don't have massive Black voter turnout in 2020 and 2022. Young folks responded to that, right? We We saw that after a lot of delay and debate that we saw some action, not as much as I and others would like to see, but we saw some action in regards to debt cancellation. You just spoke with Professor Hamilton about the impact that has in terms of the racial wealth gap. Young black voters, young black students, black youth in general care about that issue. And so for all these reasons, when you address our issues, and this goes for every age group, young, older, or whatever, when you address our issues, then we intend to turn out in terms of voter mobilization. All we ask for from policymakers, make our jobs easier, encouraging our folks to vote by showing that accountability, by responding to our issues. Those conversations at the door become a lot easier when we can show that the folks that we voted for in the past have actually responded to our issues.
I want to look forward just a little bit to 2024 because we are already hearing candidates announce their campaigning. As that starts to happen, as we get closer to 2024 and that election cycle, in what ways is Black Voters Matter starting the organizing at this moment and starting the encouragement and the mobilization of your constituents now?
So I'll start and I'll turn it over to Cliff as well so we can both weigh in on this question. One, I think that we have to recognize that part of our work is not just episodic about one election. Our work is 365 days out of the year. We are focused on how do we build Black political power. And that whether there's a presidential election happening or not, it's really important. There's always an election. There's no such thing as an off year. So this year we are working just as if it was 2024 or 2022 or 2020 where there was a midterm election because we know that there are critical local races and elections that are happening. And also we know it's really important to build the infrastructure and the ecosystem of communities that are engaged because fundamentally we know that we're in protracted struggle. That in order for us to make the kind of change that we need to make, that fundamentally it is going to take us literally being relentless in supporting and pushing an agenda that supports us. And so Cliff, I'll turn it over to you. You may want to highlight some of the work that we're doing now.
Yeah, LaTosha took the words right out of my mouth, right? We always say there's no such thing as an off year. There was an election yesterday, right? Some people have called it the most important election in the country. It took place yesterday in Wisconsin where they were voting for, in a primary for their Supreme Court vacancy that's coming up, right? You can't just mobilize for 2024 by waiting for 2024. You've got to be engaged. We call it the 365 work. You've got to be engaged all throughout the year. And that includes not just being engaged in elections of all types, including primaries like what happened yesterday, not just elections on federal offices, but including those local level, right? The county commissioners, the DAs, the mayors, the city councils. We always say you can't come knocking on my door every 4 years or come knocking on my door in late October and November saying that you need my vote to save democracy, but you weren't there for me in February when we had an election for our Supreme Court, which impacts every decision, every issue that affects my life, right? Don't come knocking on my door in 2024 if you weren't there for me in 2023 when we had a city council race or a mayor's race and we're dealing with. Don't come knocking on my door if I live in Mississippi and you weren't there when they were talking about dirty water or forming a jurisdiction that takes power away from Black folks in Jackson, Mississippi, but then you want to come knocking on my door in November or in 2024. And so we have got to be present and investing in this work. There are incredible groups doing amazing work and doing it severely under-resourced. That's why we started Black Voters Matter Fund, because LaTosha and I, we knew what it was like to be in a community like that, in a red state, in a rural community, doing great work that was under-resourced. And so we have got to support these groups. We've got to support these candidates. We've got to redefine what it means to be electable. And we've got to do all of that starting right now, not waiting until the first primary, which, we'll be glad to see will be in South Carolina, but we can't wait until 2024 to start talking about that. We've got to do this work all throughout the year, including in the odd number years.
When we talk about building Black political power, of course, a very large portion of that is organizations like your own. It includes Black voters who are showing up to the polls, but it also includes Black leaders, our policymakers. And for instance, just last night, we saw Congresswoman-elect McClellan in Virginia was elected as well. And so we're seeing like the Congressional Black Caucus welcoming its largest class in its history. How encouraging is it to see these gains, and how do we keep that momentum going toward the future?
It's really encouraging to see the gains, but more so than while I'm excited and happy for this new win, what makes me more excited is that Black voters showed up and showed out. And I think part of what we have to recognize is that sometimes we've built a democracy that in many ways, the focus has been on elected leadership. And once you put them in office, go back to your corners and everything's going to work out. We've seen in our community that doesn't work. That part of what we have to do is really build a way that we're not just getting people to engage in the electoral process, but there has to be a strong accountability process. We've seen that to be able to make sure that our votes are actually turning into kind of the policy changes that we want. And I do believe that we are in a particular moment in time, that in any moment in time, that there is a moment that we literally, with the rise of racial tension, when we're seeing anti-Blackness, that people are actually campaigning, they're building entire campaigns off anti-Blackness, that this is the moment that Black voters have to stand up. We have to organize ourselves. And I think where the real change is going to be, it is going to be when we have a strong ecosystem of grassroots organizers and organizations that are well-resourced, that are embedded in communities, so that we can actually put people in office that need to be in office, and that we can take folks out when they're not aligned with our values or our agenda.
Ms. LaTosha Brown and Mr. Cliff Albright of the Black Voters Matter Fund, thank you both so much for being here today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.